I've stood guard at 3 coronations in my life. I've never told anyone what happened at the second one. Not my wife, not the captain who trained me, not even the boy himself when he grew old enough to ask me to my face. I'm telling it now because I'm old, and old men get tired of carrying things. The carrying gets heavier than the thing itself somehow. You'd think it would be the other way around. I want to say at the start that I'm not a clever man. I never was. I learned my letters late and I still move my lips when I read, which my granddaughter teases me for. So if this comes out crooked, that's why. I'm telling it the way it sits in me, not the way a court historian would lay it down with his straight lines and his dates. I don't even know all the dates. I know it was cold. I know the rushes on the floor of the great hall smelled of old beer and somebody's wet dog. I know my left boot pinched because the leather had dried wrong by the barracks fire the week before. These are the things a man remembers, not the dates. The boy was Prince Aldrich, 11 years old that winter, small for his age with a stubborn jaw, the kind of jaw that locked tight when he decided on a thing nobody was going to talk him out of. His mother had that same jaw, the old queen, before the coughing took her 2 winters earlier. I'd seen it on her in the throne room more than once, that lock, that set of the chin. So when I saw it on the boy at the feast, I knew it for what it was. It wasn't temper. People called it temper after. It wasn't. I was assigned to the western wall of the feasting hall that night. Not close to the high table. Guards like me don't stand close to royalty. We stand where we can watch the doors and the windows and the dark mouths of the corridors, the places trouble comes from. So I saw most of what I'm going to tell you from 40 feet off, through torch smoke and the moving heads of nobles, over the shoulders of men who smelled of perfume poured on too thick to cover the fact they hadn't washed. I want to be honest about that distance. Some of what I tell you I pieced together later from things I heard, from things I worked out lying awake. Memory does that. It fills the gaps with whatever makes sense, and sometimes what makes sense isn't what was true. I've had 40 years to fill those gaps, and I can't always tell anymore which parts I saw and which parts I built. But the chair I remember exactly. I'd stake my life on the chair I'm sure of. Let me go back, though. You won't understand the chair without the rest of it. The old king died in the spring. Aldrich's father. A big man, louder than he needed to be, the sort who clapped you on the shoulder hard enough to stagger you and thought it was friendliness. He wasn't a good king and he wasn't a bad one. He was a king, which mostly meant he ate well and we didn't, and the wars he started were fought by men whose names he never learned. I bear him no grudge. He nodded at me once in a corridor and I felt it for a week, which tells you everything about how small a guardsman's life is. We live on the scraps of attention that fall off the high table. A nod, a coin tossed without looking. We tell ourselves stories about what it meant. They said it was fever that killed him. He went to bed strong on a Tuesday and by the next Sunday he was a yellow thing in a big bed, breathing like a man pulling a cart uphill and then not breathing at all. Fever happens. Men die of it all the time, kings same as the rest of us, but the court whispered. The court always whispers, that's its true work, and a king dropping dead in 5 days is the kind of meat the whispering feeds on for months. Some said poison, some said a curse. Some said the gods were angry about a temple he'd let fall into ruin to pay for a war. I heard all of it and believed none of it, because that's the discipline of the job. A guard who believes the whispers starts seeing assassins in every shadow, and a guard like that gets a man killed. Usually the wrong man. So I filed it away. Fever, most likely fever. I had a wife at home swelling with our first child, and I had no room in me for court poison. I had my own poisons to worry about, the rent on the room over the Tanners, the cost of a midwife, whether the captain would keep me on through the lean months. That's the thing nobody puts in the songs. The man guarding the king is mostly thinking about his rent. What I knew for certain, past all the whispering, was this. The old king had married twice. His first wife, Aldrich's mother, was the cold-jawed queen who died of the cough. His second wife was a younger woman, the Lady Vesrin, and she had come to the marriage already a mother. She had a son of her own from a husband before, a husband nobody at court spoke of, dead or set aside, I never learned which. The son's name was Corwin. Corwin was maybe 20 that winter. Tall, easy, a smile that came too quick and stayed too long. He wasn't of the old king's blood at all, not a drop of it, but he'd been folded into the family, the way a stranger gets folded into things when there's a crown sitting in the next room. He wore the colors. He hunted with the lords. He had rooms in the East Wing better than rooms a man of no royal blood had any right to. And nobody said anything, because his mother was the king's wife. And you don't say anything about the king's wife's son unless you're tired of having a tongue. I didn't think much of him, to be truthful. He was just another well-fed young man who'd never carried anything heavier than a wine cup. The palace was full of them. I'd have forgotten his face entirely if not for what came after. That's the strange thing about the people who turn out to matter in your life. At the time, they're just furniture. You walk past them. You don't know yet that you'll be lying awake at 70 still seeing their face. Here is the part I've never told. I'll tell it now and then I'll tell you why it matters, though you'll see it for yourself, I think. You're not slow like me. A week before the coronation feast, I had the night watch in the old wing. The corridor outside the nursery, where Aldrich had slept as a small child and still slept some nights even though he was a king now, or about to be crowned one, and far too grand for a nursery. I understood it. Boys who lose a father go crawling back to the smell of their childhood. I did the same when mine died. I was a grown man with a sword and I still went and sat in the cold barn where he'd taught me to shoe a horse, just to be somewhere that remembered him. The body wants walls that knew you before the loss. There's no shame in it. There's no age you grow out of it either. I'm proof of that. It was past midnight. The torches were burning low, that hour when the flames go small and blue at the root, and the cold comes up out of the stone floor through your boots and into your knees. My breath was smoking. I remember rubbing my hands and thinking about nothing, about the rent, about whether the baby would come before the first frost, when I heard the boy crying. Not loud, the careful kind of crying a child does once he's learned that someone might be listening. I knew that kind. I'd done that kind. You hold your own mouth half shut and you let it out in little pushes so it won't carry. It's a terrible thing to hear from a child, that disciplined grief, because it means the world has already taught him that his sorrow is a thing to be hidden. A child who cries loud still trusts the world to come. A child who cries quiet has stopped expecting anyone. I should have walked on. A guard isn't paid to listen at doors, and a decent man doesn't. But my boots had gone quiet on their own. You learn to walk quiet in this work. It stops being a choice. And I found myself standing still in the cold with my hand resting on a sword hilt I had no use for, listening to a king half my height talk to his dead father in the dark. Because that's what he was doing. He wasn't talking to anyone living. He was talking the way children talk to the dead, the way I've heard grown men talk to the dead too, on battlefields, at deathbeds, that low, steady, arguing voice, as if the dead are just being stubborn and might still be convinced. He was saying he wasn't stupid. He kept coming back to that. I'm not stupid, I'm not stupid, I saw them. He said he'd seen something and that nobody believed him, and that they'd told him grief makes a person see things that aren't there. And then he said the rest, and I wish to this day I hadn't been standing there to hear it, because a thing you haven't heard you don't have to carry. He said he had seen Corwin, in the cellar, the wine cellar, the night before his father took to his bed with the fever. He said he'd gone down for, I don't know what a boy goes to a wine cellar for at night, to hide maybe. Children find the strangest holes to hide their grief in even before they know what they're grieving. And he'd seen Corwin down there among the casks doing something with his hands at the king's own barrel, the small one, the private one that only the king drank from. And that Corwin had seen him see it, and had smiled at him. That quick, easy smile, and said nothing. And the boy had told his stepmother. Of course he had. Where else does a frightened child go but to the nearest grown woman who's meant to love him? He'd told the Lady Vesrin, and she had taken his face in both her hands. He said this, in the dark, in that small voice, she held my face. And she had told him very gently that grief makes us see things, that his father was sick and it was nobody's doing, that he must never say such a thing where the court could hear it, or he would shame himself and shame his father's memory, and people would say the new king was mad with sorrow before he'd even worn the crown. Never say it where they can hear, she told him. And the boy had believed her, or tried to, the way children try to believe the grown people who are supposed to be safe. But he couldn't make it sit right. So there he was at midnight, a week later, telling his dead father the thing he wasn't allowed to tell anyone alive. I stood there until my feet went numb, and then I made myself walk on, soft, so he'd never know. And I told myself the thing I told myself 1,000 times after. He's a grieving child. Grieving children see monsters. It's most likely fever, the way it's most likely always fever. An 11-year-old in the dark, drowning, is not a witness any court would hear, and neither, I'll say it plainly, am I. I had no proof. I had a child's voice through a door. That's nothing. That's less than nothing. A man could be hanged for repeating less than that, and his wife and his coming baby with nothing and no one. So I did what guards do. I filed it away. I put it in the place where I put the king's poison and the temple curse and all the other whispers, the deep place, the place you hope you'll never have to open again. I'd open it a week later, at the feast, when the boy stood up behind his chair, and I understood all at once, cold all the way down, exactly what I was looking at. The week between is mostly a blur, the way the days before any big thing blur. The whole palace was turned inside out for the coronation. They were scrubbing stone that hadn't been scrubbed in my lifetime. There were carts of wine and carts of meat and carts of flowers that wilted before the day came because someone cut them too early. The cooks were screaming at each other in the kitchens. I had a turn guarding the kitchen stores, and I've never heard language like it. Not in the barracks, not in war. Cooks before a feast make soldiers look gentle. I saw the lady veteran a few times that week, sweeping through the corridors with her women trailing behind her. I watched her differently now. I couldn't help it. I'd hear her low voice, and I'd think of the boy in the dark saying she held my face, and I'd watch her smile at a lord and wonder what that smile was covering, and then I'd catch myself and think, "You fool, you're doing exactly the thing the discipline warns against. You're seeing assassins in shadows because a child cried in the night. Stop it." Most likely fever. But I'll tell you a small thing, and it's the kind of thing that probably means nothing, the kind of human nothing that sits in a man for 40 years anyway. I saw her once stop a serving girl from refilling the boy's cup, a casual thing. She put 2 fingers on the girl's wrist and shook her head and had the girl pour from a different jug. And it was nothing, a stepmother fussing, watering a child's wine. Any careful woman would do it. I told myself that. But my stomach had already gone cold before my head could talk it down, and that's the thing about the body, isn't it? The body decides before you do. The body had decided about the lady veteran a week before my head would let me say it. I never told anyone that either. Who would I tell? The captain. He'd have had me whipped for a gossip, and rightly worried about a guard who watches the king's wife that close. There's no one to tell a thing like that to. That's the loneliness of the work nobody warns you about when you're a young man proud of your new sword. You see things. You're meant to see things, that's the whole job. Your eyes are why they pay you. But you're not meant to say them. You're a pair of eyes on a wall, and eyes don't talk. I sometimes think that's the truest definition of a guardsman there is. A man trained to see everything and say nothing. We're built like that on purpose. It's only later you learn what it costs to be built that way. Corwin I saw too that week, laughing in the yard, riding out with the young lords. He looked like a man without a care in the world, which is exactly how a guilty man looks and exactly how an innocent one looks, and there's no telling them apart from a wall 40 feet off, or from any distance at all, which is the whole trouble with people. The wicked don't wear it on their faces. I learned that young, and I've never unlearned it. The cruelest men I ever knew had the kindest smiles. It's the frightened ones who look guilty, the frightened ones and the grieving children. The day of the crowning itself was long, and I won't drag you through all of it. The temple part, the oil, the old words, the heavy crown going onto that small head too big for him. They'd packed the inside with cloth to make it sit. You could see the cloth if you knew to look, and the boy carrying it all with that locked jaw, not crying, not smiling, just enduring, the way I've seen wounded men endure a long ride to the surgeon. 11 years old and enduring his own crowning. I remember thinking, that's no way to come to a throne. But there's no good way. They all come to it over a grave. The feast was the night. The great hall full to the walls, every torch lit, the heat of it like a wall you walked into. Hundreds of bodies and 100 candles and the fires in the great hearths, the smell of roast fat and spilled wine and the perfume, and under it all the old smell of the rushes, beer and dog and damp. I was on the western wall, as I said, my pinching boot, my place. I had a clear enough line to the high table on its dais, up at the end, raised so all the hall could see the new king eat his first meal as king. And the seating put Corwin beside the boy. I want you to understand what that meant, because if you've never lived inside a court you might not feel the weight of it. Where a man sits at a feast is everything. It's a language. The whole hall reads it. The high table itself, raised on the dais, is for the blood the king, and those closest to the throne by blood and by right. And they had set Corwin there, at the high table, in the second chair, right at the new king's elbow, shoulder to shoulder, as if that were a natural thing, as if that were a thing the world had agreed to. A man of no royal blood at all, the stepmother's son by a forgotten husband, seated in the place that said to every lord in that hall, this one is family, this one is close to the crown, this one matters. And the boy saw it. I watched him come up onto the dais with the lady Vesrin's hand on his shoulder, steering him gentle, always so gentle, and I watched him see the two chairs side by side, and I watched his face do the thing. The jaw, the lock. His mother's lock, and he stopped. He didn't sit. He stood behind his own chair, the king's chair, with both his small hands gripping the carved back of it so hard I could see it even from the wall, see the knuckles go pale, and he did not sit down. And he did not sit down, and the hall began to notice. It went quiet in pieces. That's the thing I remember most, how it didn't go quiet all at once but in patches, the way a fire dies, first the tables nearest the dais, the talk just falling out of them, and then the next tables wondering why the front had gone still and going still themselves to listen, and the quiet spreading back and back through the whole hall until even the drunkest lord at the lowest table had stopped with his cup halfway to his mouth. Hundreds of people. The fat still dripping and hissing somewhere in a hearth. And up on the dais, a small boy in a crown too big for him, standing behind a chair he would not sit in. The lady Vesrin leaned to him. I couldn't hear it, not from the wall, not over the fires. But I saw her mouth move low and close to his ear, and I saw the shape of it, soft, coaxing, the face of a woman who knows exactly how many eyes are on her and is performing calm for every one of them. Sit, my love, whatever it was. Sit down now. Everyone's looking. Don't make a scene, not tonight, not in front of all of them. I've watched enough mouths from enough distances to read that much. And the boy shook his head, one small shake, no. And then, and this is the part I'm surest of, the part I'd swear to before any god you like, he looked. He turned his head and he looked deliberately at the empty chair beside his own. The chair they'd set for Corwin, who was standing there now not knowing whether to sit or not, caught in the open with that easy smile gone stiff on his face. The boy looked at that chair, and then he looked out at the hall, at all of us, and then back at the chair. He couldn't say it, you see. That's what broke me standing on the wall. I understood it all at once and it went through me like cold water. He couldn't say it. He was 11 years old and he was the king, and he had no proof and no voice that wouldn't be folded up soft and put away like the last one had been. Held my face. Grief makes us see things. He couldn't stand up in front of the whole court and say, I think this man poisoned my father. They'd have called it madness. They'd have said the grief had turned his mind. His stepmother would have wept and held his face, and the lords would have nodded sadly, and the boy would have spent his reign known as the mad child king who saw murderers in his own family. He knew that. Somehow, 11 years old, he knew that. Children understand power better than we give them credit for. They live their whole lives underneath it. So he did the only thing a powerless boy king could do. The only protest left to him. He refused the chair. He made the whole hall look at the empty space beside him and the easy smiling man it had been set for, and he let the silence say the thing his mouth was forbidden to say. I will not sit beside him. He couldn't tell them why, but he could make them all see that he would not, and he made them see it. Every soul in that hall saw a new king refuse, on the night of his own crowning, to sit beside his stepmother's son, and not one of them knew why, and all of them would remember it, and that was the whole of his weapon, to be remembered refusing. I have never in my life seen anything braver, and I was at 3 wars, I mean that. I've seen men charge walls. I saw a man hold a bridge alone once so the rest of us could cross, and die holding it, and that was brave. But this was a different kind. This was an unarmed child holding a line against the only people in the world who were supposed to love him, with nothing in his hands but a refusal, and holding it alone, knowing he'd be called a brat for it, knowing he could never explain, choosing to be thought a spoiled child rather than sit where he'd been told to sit. There's a kind of courage that gets you songs. And there's this kind that gets you nothing, that gets you laughed about by servants for 40 years, and this kind is rarer. I've only seen it the once. The Lady Vesrin recovered well. I'll give her that, whatever she was. She was never caught off her feet for long. She laughed light, bright, a little laugh that carried out over the silent hall like a bell, and she said something I couldn't hear but could guess the shape of. Something about the boy being overtired, the long day, the heavy crown, poor lamb, you all remember being his age. And she signaled a servant, and the servant moved Corwin's chair down the table, down off the high dais entirely, smooth as anything, as though it had always been meant to go there. And she called for the music to start, and the music started. And the hall came back to life patch by patch the way it had died, the talk catching again table by table, the cups lifting, the laughter coming back too loud the way laughter does after a fright, everyone eager to pretend it had been nothing so they could stop feeling the thing they'd just felt. By the time the second course came out, some great roasted bird, swans I think, dressed back up in their own feathers the way they did then. A horrible thing to look at if you ask me, a dead bird pretending to be alive. By then it was as if it had never happened at all. The court has a short memory for anything it would rather not have seen. That's a kind of mercy, I suppose, and a kind of rot, both at once. The boy sat down then. Once Corwin's chair was gone from beside him, he sat. He'd won the only thing he could win, and he knew to stop. He sat in his too big crown, and he ate almost nothing. I watched. He pushed the food about, and once, just once, he looked out at the hall, out over all the heads, and I have wondered ever since whether he was looking for something. A face that understood. I'll never know if he found mine, out there on the western wall in the torch smoke. I'd like to tell you our eyes met and something passed between us. They didn't. I was 40 feet off, and I'm not a man important enough to be looked at. But I like to think he was looking for someone. I like to think a part of him knew that somewhere in that hall, one person had understood exactly what he'd done. It was me I'd understood, and I did nothing. That's the part that sits worst all these years on. A man wants his story to have a place in it where he stepped forward, where he did the thing. I keep wanting to tell you that I went to someone, that I found a way, that the knowledge I carried was good for something. But I didn't, and it wasn't. I was a wall guard with a child's voice through a door and a cold feeling in my stomach about a woman's 2 fingers on a serving girl's wrist. That's nothing you can take to anyone. I had a wife near her time and a captain who'd have flogged me for the gossip and most likely turned me out. And what then? What does a turned-out guardsman do, with a baby coming, having accused the king's own stepmother of murder on the strength of nothing? I'd have destroyed my family and saved no one. The boy was already safe in the only way that mattered. Corwin's chair was moved. The wine was watched. The thing was, for that night at least, undone by the boy's own doing, not mine. I tell myself all that. I've told myself all that for 40 years. And it's all true, every word, and it has never once let me sleep easy, Being right about why you did nothing doesn't take the nothing away. The nothing stays. The nothing is the part you carry. Aldrich ruled 26 years. A good king in the end, better than his father by a long way. Careful with people. Slow to trust God. Was he slow to trust? And now you know why. Now you know where a boy learns that. He kept his own cupbearers hand-picked, and he was known for watching a room. The lords thought it was wisdom, and it was. But it was the wisdom of a child who'd watched a man smile at him over his father's wine barrel. He never married the women they pushed at him until very late. And when he did, he married a quiet woman of no great house, for no reason of state anyone could see. And I always thought, though what do I know, I'm a guardsman. I always thought he married her because he believed she wouldn't hold his face in her 2 hands and lie to him. That's a strange thing to want most in a wife, to be believed, but for him I understood it. Corwin I lost track of. He drifted from the court the way those folded-in men do once their use is gone. I heard, years later, that he died in some skirmish on the southern border, a small, ugly war over nothing, a tax road. I never learned the details and I never asked. I'll be honest with you, I felt nothing when I heard it. I'd expected to feel something. Satisfaction, maybe, or the closing of a door. I felt nothing at all. He was just a name from a long time ago by then, a face in torch smoke, a smile I'd built half my suspicions on and could no longer even picture clearly. That's the thing about the people you spend years hating quietly. By the time the world removes them, you've already become someone who doesn't need them removed. The hate burns out before the man does. It's almost a disappointment. The Lady Vesrin lived to be very old, decades. She became a kind of grand old figure of the court, the dowager, draped in honor, consulted, beloved even, by people who'd been born long after the feast and knew nothing of any of it. When she died there was real grief, genuine, thousands lining the road for the cart that bore her. History remembers her kindly. It nearly always does the powerful. They write it themselves or pay men to, and the writing outlasts the truth every time. I stood in the crowd for her funeral. I was an old man by then myself, retired, leaning on a stick, and I watched the people weep for her, and I thought about a boy in the dark saying she held my face, and I said nothing. Of course I said nothing. What was there to say, and who was there to say it to? And after 50 years, what would it even have been but the bitterness of an old man nobody would believe? And the night of the feast became a small, funny story. That's what hurts most, I think, smaller than all the rest of it but somehow the sharpest. It became an anecdote. The old servants told it to the young ones, the time the little king threw a fit at his own crowning and wouldn't sit down, wouldn't sit by his own stepbrother. What a brat, can you imagine? And they'd laugh. I heard it told that way more than once over the years, in the barracks, in the kitchens, by people who had no idea I'd been on the Western Wall that night and seen the truth of it. And every time I said nothing. I let them laugh. What would I have said? That I'd heard something through a door. That a chair had told me a truth no court on earth would hear. They'd have thought me as mad as they'd have thought the boy. So I let it be a funny story. I let the bravest thing I ever saw be a punchline in a kitchen. That's the last betrayal, you know. Not the murder. If it was murder, I'll never be sure, and I've made my peace with never being sure. Not the stepmother's 2 soft hands. The last betrayal is that the boy's one act of courage, the thing he chose at 11 over being loved, the line he held alone, it got remembered wrong. It got remembered as a tantrum. And everyone who could have remembered it right chose silence, and I was the worst of them, because I was the only one who actually knew. He's dead now too, Aldrich, the good king. Died old in his bed, watched over by his hand-picked men, his quiet wife long gone before him. They say it was peaceful. I hope it was. I wasn't there. I was long retired, long forgotten, a name on no list. He never knew me. Why would he? I was a pair of eyes on a wall, one of hundreds over the years, and the great don't learn the faces of the men who watch them. He lived his whole long, careful reign, and died his peaceful death, and he never once knew that on the western wall of his coronation feast, There stood one man who understood exactly what he did and why, and honored him for it in silence, and grieved that he could do nothing but honor it in silence. I almost told him once, near the end of my service. He passed me in a corridor, older than both of us, his beard going gray, mine already gone, and for a moment we were alone, just the two of us in a stone passage, and I had it in my mouth. Your Majesty, the night of your crowning, I understood, I saw, but I didn't. The discipline held, the discipline of a lifetime, the eyes that see and the mouth that doesn't, and the moment passed and he walked on, and that was the closest the truth ever came to being said aloud. I've hated myself for that more than for anything. The door through the nursery I can forgive. I was young, I was frightened, I had a family. But the corridor, the old man to the old man, nothing to lose by then, and still I said nothing. That one's just cowardice. I've stopped pretending it was anything else. So I'm telling you, whoever you are, reading this when I'm gone, I'm telling it down now because I can't carry it to wherever I'm going next, and I won't leave it nowhere unsaid, the way I've left it my whole life. It needs to exist somewhere outside of me before I stop existing. Here is the truth of it, plain, the way I should have said it 50 years ago to anyone who'd hear. A boy lost his father, most likely to murder, and saw the murderer smile at him, and was told by the one woman who should have protected him that he was imagining it, that he must keep silent or be thought mad. And then they sat that same smiling man down beside him at his own crowning, in the place of honor, his elbow against the boy's elbow, and dared him with the whole court watching to make peace with it. And the boy, 11 years old, crowned, alone, with no proof and no voice, and no one in all the world he could trust, refused. He stood behind his chair and gripped it till his knuckles went white, and he refused to sit, and he made the whole hall look at the empty chair, and he held that line by himself, because it was the only true thing he was allowed to do. And the court laughed it off as temper, and his stepmother lived beloved to a great old age, and the bravest thing I ever witnessed in 80 years of life became a funny story told in kitchens. And I saw all of it. I saw it from the western wall in the torch smoke with my left boot pinching, and I understood every part of it, and I said nothing. Not that night, not in the corridor, not at her funeral, not once in 50 years. I was a guard. I was built to see everything and say nothing. They made me well. That's the whole confession, not what I did, but what I watched and let pass and carried. The chair has outlasted them all. Isn't that a strange thing? The chair is the only one telling the truth in the end. The king is dead, and the stepmother is dead, and the smiling man died on a tax road, and the whole court that laughed is dust, and the only thing still standing is that empty chair beside the throne on the night of a crowning, the no a boy said with his body when his mouth was forbidden. It's outlasted everyone who sat at that table, everyone but me. And now, for a little while longer, you. So keep it for me, that's all I'm asking. I held it too long and too quiet, and I'm sorry for that, sorrier than I can write. My hand's tired and the words won't come straight. Just when they tell you the funny story, the little king who threw a fit and wouldn't sit down, you'll know. It wasn't a fit. It was the truest thing anyone did in that hall, and it was done alone, and it deserved a witness who'd speak. It only ever got me, and I'm speaking now at the very end of it, which is far too late to be any use to him. But maybe it's not too late to be true. Maybe that's the one thing left that I can still do for him, 50 years on and a lifetime late. Tell it right. Tell it true. Let the chair finally say what the boy couldn't and what I wouldn't. He didn't refuse to be seated beside that man, because he was a spoiled child. He refused because he was the only one in the room brave enough to remember what that man had done, and the only one not allowed to say it. I was the only one who knew, and now so are you.